Antonio Reid, welcome back to the Rising Tide. Today, I wanted to have a topic or discussion on global ocean level rise or sea level rise as it relates to climate change. The reason why I wanted to talk about this particular topic was because I feel like there's so much time and effort spent on climate change in terms of global average temperature, but not as much time spent on talking about the actual ocean rise and the impacts that will come from a rising ocean. So I wanted to take some time today to kind of delve into this project. But before I do that, I do want to recap on some of the things that are happening around the world as it relates to climate change. So lately I've been seeing a lot of posts on Facebook that reference the amount of flying insects that virtually disappeared. And I'm seeing that increasingly from people who are in this kind of rabbit hole, who are aware and knowledgeable about climate change and its impact on the biosphere and human society. I forget the name of the study, but it was just published in 2017 in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Science. And what the researchers conclude is that we have lost 76% of flying insect biomass from 1989 to 2016, which really encompasses the entire span of my life. I was born in 1993, and well, now it's 2018. So there you have it. So the period they're looking at is really from my birth until the present. And what I found was really surprising is that actually I went up to Sandy Chalice's house in August, and I drove kind of the back way through Virginia, West Virginia, PA, and into New York, and then back again. And there were almost no bugs splashed on my car. I thought that was really phenomenal because I remember growing up 10, 15 years ago, and it was a thing for people to go to the car wash specifically to get bugs off their car. And now that has completely disappeared. And so I looked up vanishing insects, and then voila, there we had it. 76% of flying insects have disappeared. What the study also finds is that flying insects are disappearing at about 2.8% per year, which is staggering and phenomenal, of course. And if you just extrapolate that out, that means there will be almost no flying insects or 0% biomass for flying insects by the year 2025. That's extremely alarming, especially if you know anything about agriculture, if you know anything about plant biology or biology just in general. If you understand food webs, food chains, the crisis is undoubtedly more serious than I think most people are really able to understand. At the point that we lose all of the species, or the flying insect species, we really are talking about the collapse of the food web around the world. And in fact, that's what the authors found, that regardless if they were looking at national parks in Germany, the United States, or even the Amazon, they were finding seasonally anywhere between 70 to 90% disappearance of flying insect biomass in these areas around the world. So just wanted to key you in that. But more specifically onto this issue of sea level rise, okay? So there's just some basic knowledge I want to go over. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change since 2007 hasn't really changed the sea rise numbers. They're estimating a little bit below 1 meter, maybe a little bit above a meter on average, a meter for the end of the century. For our Americans in the audience, a meter is 3 feet. So let's talk about what that actually means, because we understand, like, you know, 1 degree Celsius, the temperature rise above 1880 is the danger baseline. 2 degrees is catastrophic. 3 degrees is unfathomable. And 4 degrees is every aspect of the nightmare of Dante's Inferno's hell, and beyond. And of course, we're expected to get more than 4 degrees. So that should say something. But sea level rise has its own catastrophic levels as well. There is another paper that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Science that was estimated that over the century, the United States has 414 cities at risk being severely damaged, destroyed, or lost due to the coming sea level rise. And this is with the expectation that sea level rise will be maybe a little bit more than 3 feet, okay? So 1 foot of sea level rise is what I would consider severe. The 1 foot of sea level rise above the 9 inches that we already have seen from 1880 would be quite severe. There's a reason why that's severe. It's not literally just the beaches disappearing, but saltwater intrusion. That the sea actually seeps on the ground a lot further than you can see, particularly for places like South Florida, the Miami area. The problem they run in there is not only that their beaches will be submerged and their hotels will be submerged, and of course they will be, but even many, many miles inland, what they're going to find is that their freshwater sources will increasingly have saltwater intrusion, which will make their freshwater sources undrinkable. A lot of people have this idea that what's going to happen is, you know, the beachfront will be destroyed, but everything else in Miami will be okay. So if the sea level is going to rise 3 feet, I'll move 4 feet. No, that's a much too simplistic way to think about this. If you move 4 feet on the 3 feet, you are still way within the catastrophic zone for sea level rise. So moving a foot back, while it might sound kind of satirical and funny, it would land you squarely in the catastrophic zone. That's like saying, well, I'm going to be a mile outside of the pathway of a hurricane and I'll be okay. Probably not. So just a little info in there. And why is sea level rise so dangerous? The reason why sea level rise is so dangerous is because it impacts city infrastructure. So underground, we have electrical wiring, our fiber optics, we have our sewer pipes, we have our water lines. We have a lot of expensive infrastructure underground that keeps our cities operable. Those infrastructures will be submerged, and they do not work well under salt water, ocean water. And so for that reason, it's not as if we're going to be carving out neighborhoods in Miami and saying, well, this neighborhood's going to be abandoned, but this neighborhood isn't. Essentially, the whole city, once this starts going, will be abandoned. And we'll talk about a little bit later when exactly I think that time frame will really start to kick in. The next thing I want to talk about is, well, since we kind of understand what the danger is now, what the impacts possibly could be, well, at what level will we start to see these impacts? Well, we'll start to see them now. We have already been seeing them, okay? So the 9 inches that we've already seen has produced what they call sunny day flooding. And that's not just in Miami, most popularized in the United States in Miami, but you see this in Europe, you see this in China, you see this in the United States. You see this in South America. You see it around the world. I think if you look at the projections from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, they have a high-level trajectory, which I think is the only thing that we ought to be looking at at this time, given the fact that Paris is probably going to fall through and at least deliver us 3 degrees Celsius, a temperature rise, I think likely higher than that. But on their high-end scenario, NOAA predicts that we'll hit 6 feet by the end of the century. This is a figure that Dr. James Hansen in his 2015 paper had also mentioned. Sea level rise and ice melt, superstorms, that we'd get about 6 feet or 2 meters, double the IPCC number by the end of the century. Well, 6 feet may not sound like a lot to a lot of people, but let me explain this to you. Cities like Miami, cities like Charleston, South Carolina, cities like New York will be inundated with 2 more feet of sea level rise. The 2 feet is what I would consider, if 2 degrees Celsius is catastrophic in terms of temperature, 2 feet of sea level rise on a global average would be the catastrophic limit. That is our uppermost limit that our civilization will be able to take. I think that we'll likely get, if we're on the NOAA high-end model, if we're traveling down the road that Dr. James Hansen and his colleagues have painted for us, I think it's very likely that we will end up getting 3 feet by somewhere between 2040 and 2060, with the midpoint being 2050. That would mean that, of course, we would hit the catastrophic level of sea level rise sometime between 2035 and 2045. So that really, I think for a lot of people, it's time to start listening up. The sea is creeping inward. It is creeping inland. What I think we should start to expect is by the year 2030, places like South Florida, we're going to see the beginning of the Great Migration. The Great Migration is a term that I use that's referenced in the Age of Consequences, the 2007 Outlook for Climate Change to 2040. The head author on that is the great villain, the former advisor to the White House under the Clinton administration, the former chief of staff or transition chief for the Obama White House, and of course the campaign manager for the Hillary Rodham Clinton campaign 2016, John Podesta. He found himself working on climate change as early as 2007, from as far as I'm aware, but I'm sure much sooner than that. He's one of the top political players in the U.S., and he was warning that we are going to face these type of catastrophic scenarios, at least with the data they had in 2007 by 2040. Well, it's 2018. The IPCC has even abandoned this data 2040 and moved on to catastrophic effects by 2030. So I'm sure that the United States government is on top of that, and I'm sure their scenarios have updated since 2007 as well. But what does that mean for us? Well, the first thing it means is it's the collapse of coastal real estate around the world almost simultaneously. Within the next 2 to 3 decades, we will see the total collapse of coastal real estate. What it means is I'm 25 years old. That means is by the time that I'm 75 years old, every single map in the world that we currently see today will be wrong. All coastlines around the world would have been rearranged by the time that I am 75 years old. That is one human lifetime. The entire global coastline will be rearranged. That is phenomenal. That really is irretractable. What does this mean for countries like China? China has 300 million people. That's roughly the size of the United States living on their eastern coast in cities like Shanghai, cities like Guangzhou, cities like Hong Kong. These cities will be underwater by 2050. And they will suffer significant impacts up until leading to that time. So the Chinese have to essentially prepare for a national refugee crisis almost equal to the entire population of the United States. They're not going to do it. No one's going to be able to do anything like that. The Bangladeshis, we're talking about 150 million people who will be foreign nationals to the Chinese, foreign nationals to the Indians. By 2035, we're going to see the Great Migration occurring there. We already see, in large part, people retreating from the coastline in places like Bangladesh. The Indians have created, you know, the United States, we have this argument between the liberals, the Republicans, the Democrats about building a wall. The Indians aren't having the argument, they're building the wall. And they're mounting machine guns on them, okay? They are preparing for this crisis that is unfolding today, tomorrow, and for the rest of the time humans are on the planet. What they've decided to do is erect walls, militarize, nationalize, and militarize. And that's kind of the effect that we've seen around the world so far. Countries like India are looking at border problems with countries like Pakistan, both nuclear-armed states. This is going to be a crisis in that region as well. But one thing that I think that gets away from us, and it's been highlighted by people like Guy McPherson, whose name we shall not speak, is this whole idea that we have built around the world 450 cool water power plants. That is true. We have about 450 plus nuclear power plants stationed around the world that need cool water from rivers and lakes and oceans to keep the nuclear fuel rods at a comfortable temperature so that they don't melt, explode, and melt down. Well, given the fact that these facilities were built before we had the complex understanding of sea level rise that we now do, most of them were built in actually the exact worst places. So for the United States, we have an estimated 60 nuclear plants that will be submerged in the water, at least by the calculations I'm doing. The scientific community actually is very hesitant to take up this issue. But if you know anything about where our nuclear facilities are stationed, and you know anything about sea level rise, you can start to do the estimates yourself on paper. And we have about 50 to 60 nuclear power plants that will be in serious crises mode sometime between 2040 and 2050. And we'll start to see a lot of these unravelings. Hopefully, if Rachel Maddow cares to cover this, probably not. I'm sure Russiagate will still be going on by 2030. But if any time they decide to actually cover what's happening, they're going to find that this crisis is really going to reach a head for Americans in the 2030s. Okay, that's when the topic should really start to be talking about, because we're going to start to see nuclear power plants like the ones in South Florida start to be inundated. Okay, and this is a global problem. There's a couple of things to bring to your attention. Shutting down nuclear power plants, because you think, well, the first thing we have to do then is shut down and decommission and disassemble the nuclear power plants around the world. Well, it takes anywhere between 40 to 60 years to shut down and decommission a nuclear power plant. We don't have 40 to 60 years before we begin to get serious sea level intrusion and rise that will dismantle or make obsolete or inoperable our nuclear facilities. So we're kind of in a bend right now. I would think that the best thing that we can do is to fortify the nuclear power plants as much as we can, building complex pumping systems, complex walls, complex water diversion systems, so that we can at least give ourselves more time to decommission these nuclear power plants. But if you're listening to people like Dr. James Hansen, the problem then is, well, if you decommission these nuclear power plants, and that means we're going to have to make up the loss of energy supply somewhere, and that might lead us to being more locked into oil, natural gas, and coal. And of course, I mean, we are talking about an estimated 300 nuclear power plants that would need to be decommissioned in order for us to protect ourselves from essentially what will amount to being ionized off of the surface of the earth. So this is quite serious, and you don't see a lot of talk about this in climate change circles. Maybe because I think this is even more impossible than the temperature rise problem that we have. As you guys know, the temperature is now rising at a rate really unseen in the last 800,000 years, maybe even 3 million years. But the sea level rise is also, it's even worse, because even if we did stop all emissions, even if we did stop the global average temperature from rising, the sea is already set to rise 10 to 20 meters, okay, with the current temperatures. So we are talking not about a possibility of things happen. We are talking about an eventuality of things happening. That no matter, I don't care if you're Michael E. Mann, a white liberal college professor sitting on an ivory tower at Penn State, or if you're the president of the United States, we are going to get sea level rise of 10 to 20 meters, before this is all said and done. And that's the least that we should be expecting. Now, I do want to be clear, we're not going to see that type of sea level rise within the 21st century. But I want people to think about this. As a historian, I spent a lot of my time studying, the 1800s. Imagine if people in 1800 were debating, is there going to be a human species in the year 2000? Well, if they were looking at the data that we're looking at, the answer would be overwhelmingly no. Or at least if there would be a species, it wouldn't be anywhere near 7.6 billion. Maybe a few million people scattered all over the planet. So it's kind of interesting to think in that perspective. We think about 200 years as being a long time, but 1800, if you think about it, in human history, wasn't that long ago. And that's the equivalent that those people would have been making decisions that essentially what we'd be living in today. And obviously they did make those decisions, right? The people in 1800 were part of the Industrial Revolution. It was known by the 1850s that CO2 emissions from industrial activity would warm the planet. And there's a whole host of European and American scientists who were on the ball in the late 1850s, the 1880s, and the early 1900s on this issue. So I think what people have to, as we kind of move more to the conclusion of this talk, I think what people have to realize is that what we face is irreparable, okay? There is nothing now that we can do to avoid anything. You cannot avoid, I was at my school, we're in these Appalachian climate talks, and one of the wording put together in our resolution was avoid catastrophic climate change. There's no such thing now as avoiding catastrophic climate change, okay? If you think about it, if there's a dartboard and the middle of the dartboard is catastrophe, well, everywhere else on the dartboard would then be severe and imperiling. So you miss catastrophe, but you land on something you miss global catastrophe, but you land on global disaster. And most people who live today won't know the difference. You will not know the difference between a mid-range case scenario and the worst case scenario. For us, every 5 years will be worse than the last. That's all we will ever know. And that will be regardless of what scenario that we're on. And I think that people really need to go home and think about that. No matter what scenario we are on, it will appear that everything is getting worse for the rest of our lives. No matter what. If we're on the best case scenario is 1.5 degrees Celsius. Well, that's 0.3 degrees Celsius warmer than it is now, and look at what we're seeing now. Historic wildfires, historic sea level rise, historic snowstorm, historic hurricane, historic heat waves in the ocean and on the air, and catastrophic sea level or ice melt. That's at 1.2 to 1.3. So 1.5 would be even more of this. 2 degrees would be absolutely catastrophic, and these are the best cases scenarios. And of course, we're going to blow through 1.5 degrees Celsius. I think we already passed 1.5 degrees Celsius for a monthly average. February 2016 reached as high as 1.65 degrees Celsius. So that already tells you that we're headed nowhere good fast. We're going to blow through the 2 degrees Celsius, I think, by 2030. And I think by the 2030s, 2040s, we'll be headed to 3. And I think by the middle of the century, we're looking at 4 to 5 degrees Celsius by 2050, 2060. And then, of course, upward from there. So for us, it is this grand scenario that will be playing for the rest of our lives. And I think people have to realize, just looking at what's happening to the insects and the species around the planet alone, it's not as if that we're going to be doing what we're doing for too much longer. So that's all I wanted to really say about this whole sea level rise. Now I'm going to open up to the audience and take some questions. Oh, okay, so here we are. So one question I got from Katie: why isn't no one talking about the militarized weapons causing climate change? Well, okay, I do want to say something about this. So first of all, there are people who are talking about this. Dr. Paul Beckwith is talking about this and dispelling a lot of the myths around this. Okay, so here's my part. Are humans, are apes, capable of modifying the weather? Of course we are. We've been modifying the weather as early as I know, at least since the 1920s. But weather is not climatological. You can modify the amount of rain, or more rain or less rain in an area. You can even cause thunderstorms, but you're not going to be able to redirect a hurricane. Okay. You're not going to be able to, or I don't know any technologies that would be able to redirect a hurricane, because you got to understand, a hurricane has many more times energy than the strongest nuclear weapons on Earth. So really, we just don't have the type of energy technology to redirect a hurricane or to stop a hurricane or something like that. You know, somebody asked before, Dr. James Hansen, what would happen if we launched a nuclear weapon against a hurricane? You would have a nuclear hurricane coming toward you. You know, you wouldn't stop the hurricane. Are we able to manipulate the jet stream? These would be trillion-dollar projects that we would have to fund in order to do this. Multi-trillion-dollar projects to do things like this. I just don't think it's being done. And if it was being done, you would think that the military would be deploying this technology to protect their own bases around the world. And what we are seeing is increasingly, just when Hurricane Michael came through, it was throwing some military jets around like they were toys. You would think if the military was the one that was pushing climate change and having these weapons to deal with it, they would at least try to protect their own bases. Okay. Another question is, how do we prepare our children? You tell them the truth. You tell them the truth. I think that, you know your child better than I do, of course. I don't know your child at all. But you as a parent have to make that decision. First of all, I think that if you're somebody like me, it's wrong to have children. I can't go to bed at night and know the knowledge I have and say I'm going to go ahead and have children, because I don't think that there's anything we're going to do. Either, well, there's two aspects to this. So I don't think, in part, we'll be able to sustain a life for them. And even if we were, it would be a life of no quality, And we're going to start to see the rapid degradation of our own lives, I think, by 2030. I think that's really going to be the time that we see that. Why? Because we're going to look at the collapse of the entire third world. And those people are coming north. If you think the border crisis is anything big, just wait for another 10 years. I promise you that Americans are going to have a lot of blood on their hands. Yes, in your name, we will be killing innocent men, women, and children to maintain the closure of our border. Another comment from James Jones: nuclear waste would have to be moved inland. Most storage facilities are closing. Well, it's not just the storage, it's actually the facilities. The facilities themselves would have to be moved inland. Of course, inundating nuclear waste facilities with salt water, ocean water is no better. You know, that's also a crisis. But what I also want to highlight in this discussion is it's not just our nuclear power plants. If there's anything that we learned from Harvey, if you put industrial centers underwater, you are going to immediately elevate the amounts of chemicals, toxins, poisons, and radioactive materials in the air, in the ground, and in the water. Okay. I hate to say this, people, but industrial civilization is going to be a landmine. People are literally going to be walking around trying to survive, and they're going to get hit by this invisible wave of industrial chemicals that have gone awry. And we've seen this, right? We've seen the first responders in Houston driving to a fire scene, and they're 2-3 miles out, and then they all instantly have bloodshot red eyes. They're choking, and the next thing we know, they're 10 minutes from death. That's going to happen to people. As industrial civilization starts to go, we're going to see these things happen more and more often. Okay, so let's get some more comments from the audience. Sandy Chalices makes a comment about Fukushima, and I guess how I will drag that comment into this is that essentially, yes, we are looking at something on the order or magnitude of Fukushima times 300 occurring sometime between 2030. Let me say, starting from 2030 and lasting through 2100. I think that's what we're looking at. And look at the data coming out of Fukushima, right? A lot of people have forgotten because it happened in 2011. Well, it must be solved. It must be okay. That's the furthest thing from the truth. TEPCO, which is the nuclear energy agency over there in Japan, they released a statement about 2 years ago now, saying that they'll have they will have it contained in 20 to 30 years, or excuse me, 30 to 40 years. Anytime that a large financial corporation or something like that tells you they'll have something contained in the distant future, which for them is because they're quarterly thinkers, not yearly. So if they're talking about something on a decadal scale, essentially what they're saying is that we're not going to have this under control. And what we've seen from the Japanese is that actually every year they have to spend more and more money for their containment efforts. And that should be a prime example that really mankind, I don't think my grandfather's generation knew what they were doing when they developed these nuclear fission plants around the planet. They essentially, in doing that, had condemned their grandchildren. Condemned me. I've been condemned. Another comment, thanks to global warming now, the Army knows, choose your words better, my friend. Actually, this was a conversation that I was having a couple of days ago with some buddies of mine, and we all turned off our iPhones and threw them in the car while we were having this deep conversation. I honestly, I don't worry about that anymore. Skynet is real. It's called Google, it's called Amazon, it's called Facebook, it's called YouTube, it's called Apple, it's called Samsung. Everything that you've said over the last 10 years is in some data center now. Okay, you know, I've actually had the eerie displeasure of seeing my laptop camera turn on when I didn't activate it. So for me, this idea that, you know, we're going to watch what we say or we're going to watch what we do. No, look your computer in the eye and tell Steve Wozniak and his Pentagon friends, we know what's happening, and we are going to give you hell, and you're going to give us hell too. I mean, they're fully prepared. I mean, the conversation of putting 30,000 drones with Hellfire missiles over U.S. skies, you know, that conversation, you know, we heard a little bit of that from people like Lindsey Graham back in 2014, 2015. That's still very much real, and I think that's likely that's what's going to happen. Because the military is prepared. I mean, we have 300 million people in the United States alone who are going to be they're going to have a lack of water. They're going to have a lack of food. So let's take another comment from the audience here.
Katie.
Justin Wilson made an interesting comment. Oh, I just saw, I'll get to that one next. But Justin Wilson had a comment. I teach my 15-year-old daughter what's happening, and she doesn't seem to care. I think that's true for most people. If you're 15, if you're 35, or if you're 55 or 85, I think that most people look at yesterday and they look at tomorrow and they look at today and they all kind of look the same. So is it really going to be the case that I wake up one day and my neighbor's going to bust through my, you know, house? If you listen to Humpty Dumpty Tribe, I have a interview where I kind of make a sinister joke that I have a can of SpaghettiOs. Actually, I've moved out of my parents' house since then, but I had a can of SpaghettiOs in my closet specifically for the day when my neighbor comes through, blowing through my door and puts a bullet in my head. That's going to be his reward. Nobody sees that as tomorrow. Nobody visions that that's going to be the next day for me. So nobody can really comprehend. I can't comprehend, right? I can't comprehend what does it mean that the next 10 years our lives will be. I don't know what it means that we'll have no flying insects. I have no idea what that means. I have no idea what it means that we'll be going through 300 Fukushima-like incidences. I have no idea what it means that 400 plus American cities will disappear underwater by 2100. And so a lot of, in a big sense, it's not that people don't care. They just don't have any intellectual capacity to actually understand, to really generate what that means in their head. What that means for them is, oh, I'll die. But really, it's a lot. People don't, you know, watching movies like The Road, watching movies like Mad Max give you a kind of a misnomer. I think the best movies, and we were talking about this with my friends, the best movies for what we're about to go through are movies more like World War Z. You know, the zombies are you and your family, not, you know, roaming around, literally biting people and stuff like that. But in a sense, this is the zombie is supposed to be really the disillusioned industrialist, right? So the person who's wearing a suit and tie every day, who's going to sit behind a computer to do some trend line analysis for Wells Fargo, is now out in the streets with a baseball bat or a gun beating his neighbor for the last can of SpaghettiOs. That's what the zombie paradox is supposed to show, is that even the most civilized professional people will be madmen in this time of reckoning, okay? Shelley Klein, I want to respond to this because I did actually get this criticism a lot, and I actually like this criticism because I actually have a lot to say about it. You're preaching. What help are you offering? Well, first of all, the point of preaching is that you are soothing the ears of the choir. You know, you're leading the voice on the issue. In the words of the Christians, the word became flesh. And so you speak these things with the intentions of manifesting action. One of the things that I'm doing, and actually many of the things that I'm doing, well, right now I'm working with my school, Appalachian State University in North Carolina, to reach net zero emissions by 2025. This is a small start. I have greater plans for the school. I hope to turn the school, or I hope that we can turn the school through this process into a sanctuary for what will essentially be the apocalypse. That's a small step. Another thing that I'm doing is I'm working with Stuart Scott, Scientists Warning for Humanity, trying to get the information out. I'm part of the translation team there. We're translating the message in over 25 different languages to people around the world. I'm working with the Environmental Coffee House, educating people on the reality of the situation and crisis that we face. I would ask Shelley Clayton, what are you doing? And that's actually the most important question, actually, because people like me are actually doing things behind the scene, even though it's not the bulk of the conversation. But it's really up to our viewers and our listeners. What are you doing? Because if I'm only just talking to you, then we are missing the point. And then my words are in vain. So hopefully what I'm saying is urging you, first of all, to do your own research, and then to look out into your own community. Work with your community and develop plans of resiliency. You know, just like I gave the idea that I don't think that we should immediately start decommissioning nuclear power plants around the world. I think that should be part of the strategy. But what's not also being talked about is diverting water away from nuclear facilities so we have more time to do that. And I don't see any projects like that happening around the world at all, actually. So it's about informing people, especially in communities that have nuclear power plants. They're actually, the closest nuclear power plant to me is almost 50 miles away. So it's not in my immediate facility, but one of the things that are in my immediate facilities is that working on my school to reduce its emission. There's 18, or it's almost 20,000 people at my school. So that's one act that's going to have the effect of lowering the emissions for 20,000 people. I would love to see more people across schools around the United States do this. Imagine if every single university was doing what my university is doing. You know, we release about 70,000 metric tons of CO2 emissions into the atmosphere a year. I mean, multiply that times 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, how many universities are out there. You know, that would be quite significant, okay? And then a lot of the strategies and technologies that we develop at our universities, we export into our cities and our surrounding territories. So let's take another comment. What is that you don't like about OMTEC, which is the Ocean Mechanism Thermal? Patrick is a good friend of mine, and he's been talking about this for some time. I don't have a problem with it. I don't have a problem with any solution. I think, Patrick, what you mean to do is aim your comments to in your questions to someone who has the financing to take on these type of infrastructure projects. I think that solutions like that are definitely have to be part of the conversation, and we have to do anything we can to redistribute the heat energy in the planet now. And we have to do that if we're going to survive. And I think that along with reducing CO2 emissions, sequestering technologies, with distributing heat energy around the planet, I think these are all things that we're going to have to talk about, and we're going to have to implement these things. I don't have anything against OMTC. I just haven't seen it put together by at least any type of scientific organization with any type of reputable credit. If I did, please share the information. I would love to look into it. Okay, going back to the comments. The wells are dying. This is from Kiln Johnson. The wells are dying here because they have no salmon. This is another one of those things that I'm talking about as far as the destruction of our ecosystem around the world, is that what we are starting to see is that as species disappear, we see a cascading effect. What we are seeing is that, for example, with the flying insects, which is what I've recently studied, that means that essentially after 2025, we're going to see a collapse of bird populations. We're going to see a collapse of bat populations. We're going to see a collapse of rodent populations. And I mean, it's just going to spiral from there. I mean, this is really, really hitting us. And, you know, back to the comment about your 15-year-old daughter not caring, what I find true in my life is that people begin to care shortly before they die. Another comment. Oh my gosh, we have a fire towards Mount Helens, Lake County, California, burning again. Well, again, that's what we should be expecting, is that from here on out, we're going to see historic fires. We've been seeing historic fires this year in Greenland. We saw historic fires in Siberia. We saw historic fires in British Columbia. We saw historic fires in California. We saw historic fires in Washington State, Montana, Nebraska, Utah. I think that's what we should expect from here on out, is historic fires. So the last thing I want to talk about is this whole idea about fake news and really the wider society. I think what's happening, Amitash Ghosh is an Indian writer. What he calls, and this is particularly true for the West, for actually what happened to be descendants of Europeans, there is something happening to Western people. Essentially the West is irrational. The West has, I think, committed itself to some type of societal suicide. It's very interesting because, you know, we think back to people like Rousseau. We think back to people like Marx. We think back to people like Friedrich Nietzsche. And we think about the Western intellectual tradition occurring in the context of rationalism, empiricism, and the Enlightenment. Well, the descendants of that have now moved in full retreat. We are moving away from rationalism, right? We have a Democrat Party or Republican Party as part of our government, right? They're looking at the data, the empiricism coming from NASA, coming from NOAA, coming from the IPCC, coming from the EPA and others. And they're acting exactly in the opposite. It was once held in Western society that we developed these institutions so they might help us govern the course of our civilization. Now in Western society, that isn't true. If NASA says if we pump the CO2 in the atmosphere, we'll end the species, so we shouldn't do it, we go ahead and do it. If the EPA says that fracking contaminates water and it's going to poison our population, we go ahead and do it. It's almost as if in the Western civilization that we have produced these institutions to provide knowledge so that we will do exactly what they are asking us not to do. And so in that sense, we should expect that our education systems have now become propaganda systems. We should expect what Noam Chomsky's been telling us all along. The news has been fake since before, Trump had termed that term. Chomsky was calling it manufacturing consent. So I think for a long time, the West has rejected reality. We kind of achieved this high energy and intense life. All of our needs were being met. And so reality, in a sense, became unreal. And now we're kind of living with the consequences of that. People are seeing that, in fact, reality is not unreal and that there are consequences to our action. And the fake news is only another layer to that, right? You have people like Rachel, and I don't even mention Fox News because everybody here that has a scintilla of dignity and respect for their own intellectual being know that Fox News is nothing that any human should ever watch on their worst day. But it's things like CNN, it's things like MSNBC, CBS, NPR. These lesser, more discreet news media outlets, they're just as propagandistic. Their purpose is to maintain the status quo. Their purpose is to inform you, but within the confines of what is appropriate in order to maintain the status quo. So in that sense, no. Rachel Maddow, Christopher Hayes, Anderson Cooper, Don Lennon will not be covering the apocalypse. They will not be covering this. And if they do, it will be episodic. There won't be any far-reaching connections between why we're losing Miami and seeing catastrophic wildfires in California at the same time. And mind you, and as we go, that all this has just begun. We really don't know what it looks like when we began to see the Arctic ice retreat. We really just don't understand the implications of that. Paul Beckwith, someone I like and does a really good job, I think that if you look at one of his videos, he kind of tries to explain to you that at the loss of the Arctic sea ice, we will essentially push our planetary conditions back 3 million years. And this is something that's going to occur in the next 10 to 20 years. 3 million years of paleoclimate occurring within a decade or two. I just don't think people can fathom that. So my last words to you is prepare yourself spiritually, prepare yourself intellectually, prepare yourself physically. Be with the people you love them, and love the living planet. Thank you for joining us at the Environmental Coffee House, The Rising Tide, and I'm Antonio Reid, your host.